I told my husband one thing: don't bring your female boss to your birthday dinner. He laughed it off, called me jealous, and made her his honored guest. When the night ended, she stormed out in tears, and her lawyer just called me this morning. Now everyone's asking, what did I do to make her lose control? If you bring Nora to your birthday dinner, I will make sure you regret it. The words came out of my mouth before I could second-guess them. Lucas didn't even look up from his phone. He just laughed, that hollow sound that had replaced the genuine warmth I used to know, and kept scrolling through whatever was more important than this conversation. More important than us. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and supporting stories about boundaries, respect, and standing up for yourself. If you believe that documentation and evidence matter when protecting what's yours, please consider subscribing. It helps these stories reach others who need them. Now let's see what happens next. I sat across from him at our kitchen table on what should have been an ordinary Wednesday morning. The sun was coming through the window behind him, lighting up the gray threads in his dark hair that seemed to multiply every time I really looked at him. His coffee sat untouched in the ceramic mug I'd given him last Christmas, the one with his initials etched in gold that had cost me more than I wanted to admit. The coffee was probably cold by now, but he hadn't noticed. He never noticed anything anymore unless it came through his phone screen or had Nora's name attached to it. I'd been rehearsing those words for 3 days. Testing different versions in my head while I drove to work, while I showered, while I lay awake next to him at night listening to him sleep. I'd measured every syllable to make sure I didn't sound hysterical or emotional or any of the things he could use to dismiss what I was saying. My voice had come out exactly the way I wanted it to. Quiet. Steady. The same tone I used at work when I was documenting evidence that would eventually dismantle someone's entire case. But Lucas just laughed. "Jesus, Harper, you sound paranoid," he said, finally glancing up at me with those blue eyes that used to make my stomach flip in the best way. Now they just made me feel sick. There was nothing behind them when he looked at me anymore. No recognition of who I was or who we'd been together. Just mild irritation that I was interrupting whatever he was doing on his phone. "Nora's my boss," he continued, already looking back down at his screen. "It's a work dinner as much as it is my birthday. You know how important this promotion is. I need her there." The way he said need made my jaw clench. Like it was a simple fact I was too stupid or too jealous to understand. Like working as a litigation paralegal for 12 years had taught me nothing about reading people, about recognizing when professional boundaries had been crossed and then completely demolished. I set my own coffee mug down on the marble countertop with deliberate care. The soft click it made felt too loud in the silence stretching between us. My coffee had gone cold too, but I kept my hands wrapped around the ceramic because I needed something solid to hold on to while I watched my marriage dissolve in real time. "It's not a work dinner, Lucas. It's your 40th birthday at Marcello's, the restaurant where you proposed to me 9 years ago. The reservation is under our name, not your company's. And if you make her your guest of honor while I sit there playing the supportive wife, we're done." He rolled his eyes. Actually rolled his eyes like I was being dramatic about something that didn't matter. "You're being ridiculous. Nora's been instrumental in my career development. She's mentored me through some really tough projects. Having her there shows respect and professionalism. You'd understand if you weren't so threatened by successful women." That was Lucas's specialty now. Turning every legitimate concern I raised into evidence of my personal inadequacy. I was never worried about something real. I was always jealous, insecure, threatened. The fact that Nora Castellano, his 47-year-old boss and regional director of operations at Brennan Logistics, had been texting my husband at 11 o'clock at night with messages like "thinking about our strategy session tomorrow" followed by a winking emoji apparently meant nothing. I was just being dramatic. I'd been watching it happen for months. Documenting it the way I'd been trained to document everything at work. The cologne was the first thing I noticed. Tom Ford, expensive and subtle, the kind that lingers just long enough to be memorable. I'd never bought it for him. When I asked about it casually one morning while he was getting dressed, he shrugged and said a colleague recommended it. He didn't say which colleague. I didn't ask. I just made a mental note and moved on. Then came the haircuts. Lucas had always been the kind of man who let 6 or 8 weeks pass between trims, showing up to the barber only when his hair started bothering him. Suddenly he was going every 2 weeks, his hair always perfectly styled, his beard trimmed with precision. He started buying new clothes too. Button-down shirts in colors he'd never worn before, pants that actually fit instead of the baggy ones he'd been wearing since before we got married. He was rebuilding himself piece by piece into someone I barely recognized. Someone who cared about impressing a person who wasn't his wife. I watched all of this happen and said nothing. Just took notes. Photographed receipts when I found them in his jacket pockets. Documented dates and times and changes in behavior. Built my case the way I'd learned to build cases at work, with patience and precision and the understanding that one piece of evidence means nothing but 50 pieces create a pattern nobody can explain away. What Lucas didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know because he'd stopped really seeing me months ago, was that 3 months earlier I'd filed an anonymous HR complaint against Nora Castellano. I'd used a burner email account I'd set up specifically for this purpose and filled the complaint with details I'd gathered from Lucas's careless comments about office politics, from things he mentioned in passing without realizing what he was revealing. The complaint was carefully worded. Professional. It alleged that Nora showed preferential treatment to male employees she found attractive, that she blurred professional boundaries in ways that made people uncomfortable, that she'd been the subject of whispered concerns for years but nobody wanted to risk their career by speaking up officially. I'd attached what limited evidence I could access at the time. Vague references to late-night communications and inappropriate social interactions. The complaint went nowhere because it was anonymous and the evidence wasn't concrete enough to trigger a formal investigation. But I knew it was sitting in a file somewhere in HR. A red flag attached to Nora's name. Something that would become relevant later when I had more ammunition. I'd learned something crucial during my 12 years working in litigation. People who make threats rarely follow through. They say dramatic things in moments of anger, draw lines they'll erase later, make ultimatums they'll walk back when things calm down. But people who make promises, real promises stated calmly and clearly with full intention behind them, those people always follow through. Lucas stood up from the table, his cold coffee still untouched in the expensive mug that was probably a waste of money now that I thought about it. He was already absorbed in his phone again, scrolling through what I could see were notes about his birthday dinner. Guest list. Menu options. Seating arrangements. He'd reserved the private dining room at Marcello's 2 weeks ago. I knew because I'd seen the confirmation email in his inbox when his laptop was open on the kitchen counter. The same private dining room where he'd proposed to me 9 years ago on my 28th birthday, back when he still planned surprises and wrote me notes and looked at me like I was the most interesting person in any room. Now he was using that same room to celebrate turning 40, and he was treating it like a corporate event. Custom menu featuring his favorite dishes. Premium wine pairings that cost more per bottle than we usually spent on groceries for a week. He was even hiring a professional photographer to document the evening because apparently turning 40 required the same level of visual evidence as a wedding. I'd seen his guest list too. 14 people. Colleagues from work whose names I recognized from his complaints about office politics. Friends from the gym he'd joined 6 months ago. People I'd never met who apparently knew more about his current life than I did. His brother Marcus, who'd never particularly liked me and had stopped pretending otherwise around the time Lucas started changing his cologne. And right at the top of the list, her name circled twice in his notes app, was Nora Castellano. While Lucas planned his celebration with more enthusiasm than he'd shown for anything involving me in years, I was making my own preparations. I'd already scheduled coffee with Rachel Mendoza for Friday morning. Rachel had worked at the same firm as me years ago, back when I'd had vague plans of becoming an attorney myself before life and Lucas and financial reality had redirected those ambitions. Rachel was a senior partner now at a different firm. She specialized in employment law and workplace harassment cases, and she had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting employees from supervisors who abused their power. I'd kept in touch with her over the years, casual coffee meetings every few months. Professional networking that never felt forced because we genuinely liked each other. I needed to understand exactly what happened when someone in authority was exposed publicly for having an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. I needed to know the procedures, the timelines, the likely outcomes. I needed to know what weapons were available to me before I decided which ones to use and how to use them most effectively. Lucas kissed the top of my head absently as he passed, the way you might pat a dog lying near your feet. His mind was already somewhere else. Probably already at work. Already thinking about Nora and whatever presentation he had planned for her today. I need to get to the office early, he said, heading toward the door with his phone still in his hand. Big presentation for Nora this afternoon. She wants to review my progress on the Morrison account. Of course she did. Lucas. I said, and he paused in the doorway, still not really looking at me. His attention was already gone, already focused on whatever the day ahead held. Whatever Nora wanted from him. I meant what I said. About the dinner. He smiled then. Not warmly, not the way he used to smile at me when we were happy. Just that patient, slightly condescending smile you give someone who's being difficult about something that doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. You're going to love it once you see how nice everything is, Harper. Trust me. I've put a lot of thought into making this special. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click that matched the sound my coffee mug had made earlier. I sat alone in our kitchen with 2 cold cups of coffee and a promise I fully intended to keep. The house felt too quiet after he left. Too empty. I looked around at the kitchen we'd renovated 3 years ago, at the marble countertops I'd picked out and the backsplash tile I'd spent weeks choosing. At the breakfast nook where we used to sit on Sunday mornings reading the paper and planning our week. All of it felt like set decoration now. Props in a marriage that had stopped being real somewhere along the way while I wasn't paying attention. Or maybe I had been paying attention. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I'd noticed every single change, every shift in his behavior, every new distance that opened between us. Maybe I'd been documenting the death of our marriage with the same methodical precision I used to document evidence at work. And now I finally had enough proof to do something about it. I picked up my phone and opened the encrypted folder I'd created 6 months ago. The folder Lucas didn't know existed because he'd stopped asking about my phone or my life or anything I did when he wasn't around. Inside were 173 items. Screenshots of text messages I'd photographed from his phone while he was sleeping. Copies of expense reports I'd captured from his laptop showing dinners for 2 at restaurants we'd never been to together. Bank statements showing cash withdrawals that didn't match any receipts in our shared files. Credit card charges at hotels during times he'd claimed to be working late at the office. Every piece of evidence was dated, annotated, organized by category and timeline. I'd built this case the way I built cases at work. Patiently. Thoroughly. With the understanding that you don't get justice by being loud or emotional. You get it by being prepared and knowing exactly what you're doing when the moment comes. That moment was coming soon. Lucas's birthday dinner was in 10 days. 10 days for him to change his mind, to listen to what I'd said this morning, to choose his wife over his boss. But I already knew he wouldn't. He'd made his choice months ago when he started buying new cologne and getting bi-weekly haircuts and texting Nora at midnight. He'd made his choice every time he came home late smelling like expensive wine and told me he'd been working on the Morrison account. So I'd made my choice too. And unlike Lucas, I always followed through on my promises. I called Rachel Mendoza on Friday morning from my car during my lunch break, parked in the far corner of the lot where nobody from my office would see me. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up, her voice warm but distracted in the way of someone juggling multiple cases at once. Harper, it's been too long. How are you? I need your help with something, I said, skipping the pleasantries because I didn't have the energy to pretend this was a social call. Can we meet for coffee? Somewhere away from our usual spots. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her shifting gears from casual friend to attorney mode. How soon? Today if possible. That's serious? Yes. We met at a cafe 40 minutes from both our offices, in a neighborhood neither of us had reason to visit. The kind of place where the coffee was decent but unmemorable, where the clientele was mostly people passing through on their way to somewhere else. Rachel arrived 10 minutes late, apologizing about a client call that had run over, her gray suit slightly wrinkled from what she explained had been a 14-hour day that started before sunrise. We ordered cappuccinos that cost $8 each and tasted like burnt beans, and I waited until we were seated in a corner booth before I spoke. If someone in a position of authority at a company is having an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, and that relationship gets exposed publicly in a way that embarrasses the company, what happens? I stirred my coffee even though I'd added nothing to it. The motion gave me something to do with my hands while Rachel studied me with the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who'd spent 20 years representing employees against corporations. Is this hypothetical? Not exactly. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and I watched her mind work through the implications of my question. Rachel had always been quick, one of the smartest people I'd worked with back when we were both starting out in law. She didn't need me to spell out what I was really asking. Depends on the company's policies and how much liability they're facing, she said finally. But typically, if there's documented evidence of an inappropriate relationship between a supervisor and subordinate, especially one that involves potential misuse of company resources or preferential treatment, the company moves fast. Immediate investigation. Suspension pending review. If the evidence is damning enough, termination and potential legal action for ethics violations. Even if the person is senior? Especially if they're senior. The higher up you are, the harder you fall, and the more incentive the company has to make an example of you. She paused, took a sip of her terrible coffee. Companies don't play around with this anymore, Harper. One viral moment, one public scandal, and their reputation is destroyed. They'll sacrifice anyone to contain it. I nodded slowly, absorbing this information. What kind of evidence would you need? Rachel smiled, but there was no humor in it. Documentation. Text messages, emails, expense reports, witness testimony. Anything that establishes a pattern of behavior. The more evidence you have, the less wiggle room they have to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. She looked at me carefully. Whatever you're planning, make sure you're protected. Document everything. Don't do anything that could backfire legally. I work in litigation, Rachel. Documentation is what I do. We talked for another 30 minutes about procedures and timelines, about how these investigations typically unfolded and what outcomes were most likely. By the time I left that cafe, I had exactly what I needed. A roadmap for what would happen once I pulled the trigger. Lucas spent the next 2 weeks planning his birthday dinner with an intensity one hadn't seen him apply to anything involving me in at least 3 years. Maybe longer. I watched it happen from the periphery of our marriage, invisible in my own home, and cataloged every detail. He obsessed over the seating chart. I found 4 different versions of it in the trash, each one slightly modified, each one positioning Nora Castellano immediately to his right in the spot that traditionally would have been mine. I was relegated to the middle of the table in every version, sandwiched between his brother Marcus and someone named Trevor from accounting. He spent hours researching wine pairings, calling Marcello's repeatedly to adjust the menu. I heard him on the phone one evening explaining that they needed to add a seafood course because his guest of honor loved oysters. He didn't mention that his wife was allergic to shellfish and would spend the entire course watching everyone else eat while she sat there with nothing. I watched all of this happen and felt something cold and calculated settle in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. Anger was hot and reactive and clouded your judgment. This was something else. This was the feeling I got at work when I was building a case, when I could see all the pieces falling into place and knew exactly how it would end. Lucas showed me the final guest list one evening while I was making dinner. He wouldn't be home to eat. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his notes app, pointing out each name like he was presenting evidence of how important he'd become. Trevor from accounting is coming and Miguel from operations. Oh, and the guys from my gym. You remember them, right? We met them at that charity run last year. I didn't remember them. I nodded anyway. And obviously Nora, he continued, his voice taking on a different tone when he said her name. Warmer. More animated. She's bringing a +1 apparently. Probably her husband. There it was at the top of his list, circled twice in red digital ink. Nora Castellano +1. Sounds like quite a party, I said, chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. It's going to be perfect. I really think this could be the night that solidifies the promotion. Having Nora there, showing her how well I network, how I bring people together. It's all part of the bigger picture. The bigger picture that apparently didn't include making his wife feel valued or respected or even acknowledged. Marcus called on Thursday evening, ostensibly to confirm he was attending Lucas's birthday dinner, but the conversation quickly revealed its real purpose. So Harper, Lucas tells me you're feeling insecure about his boss coming to dinner. I was standing in our kitchen, chopping vegetables for yet another dinner Lucas wouldn't be home to eat, and I stopped mid-slice. The knife blade caught the overhead light and for a moment I just stared at it. Lucas said that? Yeah, he mentioned you were having some jealousy issues. Look, I get it. Marcus's voice carried that particular brand of condescension he'd perfected over the years. Nora's successful, she's confident, she's everything you probably wish you could be. But maybe you should work on yourself instead of making Lucas's big night about your insecurities. Lucas's younger brother had never approved of me. That much had been clear from the moment we met 10 years ago at a family barbecue where he'd asked what I did for a living and then spent 20 minutes explaining why paralegals were basically failed lawyers. He was a financial analyst who made good money and never let anyone forget it, who wore watches that cost more than my monthly salary and drove a car that probably cost more than our annual mortgage payments. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus," I said, my voice carefully neutral even though I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of his analysis of my psychological state. "I'll make sure to work on myself. That's all I'm saying. Lucas is really stressed about this promotion, and the last thing he needs is you making scenes or being difficult at his party." I thanked him for calling, ended the conversation and added his name to the mental list of people who would learn the truth too late to do anything about it. That night, after Lucas finally came home at 11 claiming he'd been working late on the Morrison account, after he'd showered and fallen asleep without asking about my day or noticing the dinner I'd made and thrown away, I took his phone from the nightstand. I knew his passcode. He thought I didn't, but I'd watched him enter it enough times over the past 9 years that the pattern was burned into my memory. 4 digits that spelled out the first 4 letters of his mother's name. Not my name. Never my name. I photographed everything. Text messages between him and Nora that had started professional 6 months ago and gradually shifted into something else entirely. Messages sent at 11 at night that read thinking about our strategy session tomorrow, followed by emojis that had nothing to do with work. Inside jokes I didn't understand. References to conversations I hadn't been part of. The encrypted folder on my laptop had grown substantially since that morning I'd made my promise. 173 items, each one carefully dated, annotated, organized by category and timeline. Screenshots of texts. Copies of expense reports showing dinners for 2 at restaurants I'd never been to. Bank statements with cash withdrawals that didn't match any receipts in our shared files. Credit card charges at hotels during times Lucas had claimed to be working late at the office. I also had photos from his company's internal social network. Posts where Nora commented with flirty remarks and heart emojis. Pictures from team events where they stood just a little too close, where her hand rested on his arm just a little too long. I was building a case the way I'd learned to build cases at work. Methodically. Patiently. With the understanding that one piece of evidence means nothing but 50 pieces form a pattern no one can deny. By the time Lucas's birthday dinner arrived, I would have everything I needed. Not just suspicions or gut feelings or the vague sense that something was wrong. I would have documentation. Evidence. Proof that could be verified and cross-referenced and presented to people who had the authority to do something about it. Lucas stirred in his sleep, and I quickly locked his phone and placed it back on the nightstand exactly where he'd left it. I returned to my side of the bed and lay there in the darkness, listening to him breathe, thinking about Marcelo's and seating charts in the moment when everything I'd been building would finally matter. 10 days left until his birthday dinner. 10 days until I kept my promise. The night of Lucas's birthday dinner arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I stood in our bedroom getting ready, watching Lucas in the mirror as he adjusted his tie for the 3rd time. He'd bought a new suit for tonight. Charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind that probably cost more than he'd admit if I asked. Which I wouldn't. "You look nice," I said, because that's what wives say even when their husbands are dressing up to impress someone else. He glanced at me briefly in the mirror. "Thanks. You should probably wear the blue dress. The one with the sleeves. Not the black one that made me feel confident. Not the green one he used to say brought out my eyes. The blue one with sleeves that covered my arms and hit below my knee. Conservative. Forgettable. Appropriate for someone who was meant to fade into the background of her own husband's celebration." I wore the blue dress. We arrived at Marcelo's separately because Lucas needed to get there early to make sure everything was set up properly. I drove myself, parked in the lot behind the restaurant, and sat in my car for 5 full minutes before going inside. My phone was in my purse, fully charged. The encrypted folder was backed up to 3 separate cloud servers. Everything was ready. The private dining room looked exactly like Lucas had described it over the past 2 weeks. Black and gold balloons clustered in corners like expensive tumbleweeds. Arrangements of white roses sat on every available surface, their petals so perfect they almost looked artificial. Small placards with names written in elaborate calligraphy marked each seat around the long table that dominated the room. The restaurant smelled like expensive wine and roasted garlic, underlaid with something floral from all the roses. The kind of smell that would normally make me hungry but tonight just made my stomach turn. I could hear conversation and laughter from the main dining area, the clatter of dishes and the low hum of other people's normal Friday nights. I found my name card exactly where I knew it would be. Middle of the table, right side, between Marcus and Trevor from accounting. I picked it up and studied the calligraphy, the careful loops and flourishes that spelled out my name like I was just another guest at this event. Like I hadn't been married to the guest of honor for 9 years. Lucas's card sat at the head of the table, positioned like a throne. And immediately to his right, in the spot that every wedding I'd ever attended had taught me belonged to the spouse, was Nora's name. The calligrapher had added a little flourish to the final letter, making it look almost decorative. Basic. I stared at that card for a long moment, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest. This was really happening. He'd really positioned her there. Put her in my spot. Made his choice visible and documented in calligraphy for everyone to see. I took out my phone and photographed the seating arrangement. Wide shot first, then close-ups of the relevant cards. Added them to my encrypted folder with a timestamp and brief notation. Seating chart, spouse displaced, boss positioned in traditional spouse location. Guests started arriving around 7. I stood near the entrance playing the role Lucas had assigned me, greeting people I mostly didn't know, directing them to the bar, making small talk about traffic and weather and how nice the decorations looked. Marcus arrived and gave me a brief hug that felt obligatory, asked if I was feeling better about tonight, smiled when I said I was fine. Trevor from accounting arrived with his wife, a pleasant woman named Sarah who seemed genuinely happy to be there. Miguel from operations came with a date. The gym friends showed up in a cluster, all wearing sport coats that looked uncomfortable on them, like they didn't dress up often. Lucas worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, laughing at jokes, making sure everyone had drinks. He was good at this part. Always had been. The social performance of being successful and well-liked and important. He kept checking his phone. Looking toward the entrance. Waiting. Nora arrived at 7:32. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone when I heard Lucas's voice change pitch. When I heard him say her name with that particular warmth he used only for her now. She wore a dress that made every other woman in the room look underdressed by comparison. Deep burgundy, cut low enough that I saw Marcus do a double take, paired with heels that added at least 4 inches to her height. She carried herself like someone who'd never questioned her right to be in any room, who'd never faced consequences for anything because the rules simply didn't apply to people like her. Her husband wasn't with her. The +1 Lucas had mentioned apparently wasn't happening. I watched from my position near the bar as Lucas practically abandoned the conversation he was having and moved toward her. He took her coat himself, complimented her appearance loud enough that people turned to look, then guided her around the room making introductions like she was visiting royalty and we were all fortunate to be in her presence. "This is Nora Castellano, my regional director," he said to Trevor and Sarah. "She's been absolutely instrumental in my development this year. I honestly don't know where I'd be without her guidance." Nora smiled graciously, shook hands, made appropriate noises about how talented Lucas was, how much potential he had, how fortunate the company was to have him. When they reached me, Lucas's hand was on her lower back. A casual touch that looked comfortable. Familiar. "You remember Harper?" he said like I was someone Nora might have forgotten. Like I was peripheral to his life story. "Of course," Nora said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "It's lovely to see you again. We'd met exactly twice before. Once at a company holiday party 2 years ago, and once when I'd stopped by Lucas's office to drop off his forgotten laptop. Both times she'd been professionally pleasant and completely forgettable. Now she was standing in front of me wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly salary, about to sit in my seat at my husband's birthday dinner. "You look beautiful," I said, because that's what women say to each other even when we mean other things. "Thank you. So do you." She didn't mean it. I could tell by the way her eyes barely registered my blue dress with sleeves before moving on to something more interesting over my shoulder. Lucas guided her toward the bar, his hand still on her back, and I watched them order drinks together. Watched him lean close to hear her over the ambient noise. Watched her laugh at something he said, touching his arm in that way people do when they're comfortable with each other's physical space. The photographer Lucas had hired was already working, moving around the room capturing candid moments. I saw him photograph Lucas and Nora at the bar, their heads bent together, both smiling. Saw him capture the moment Marcus clapped Lucas on the shoulder in congratulations for something. Saw him photograph the elaborate decorations, the roses, the calligraphy name cards. I made sure I was in none of those photos. Stayed at angles where the photographer's lens wouldn't naturally fall. This needed to be documented, but I didn't need to be part of the story it told. Dinner was called at 8. Everyone moved to their assigned seats, finding their name cards, settling into chairs around the long table. I watched Lucas pull out Nora's chair for her, watched her sit in the spot that should have been mine, watched him take his position at the head of the table with her immediately to his right. I sat between Marcus and Trevor, exactly where I'd been assigned. Sarah sat next to Trevor, which meant at least I had one friendly face nearby. She smiled at me warmly, commented on how lovely everything looked, asked if I'd helped plan the party. No, I said honestly. This was all Lucas. The first course arrived. Some kind of salad with arugula and shaved parmesan that probably tasted fine but turned to cardboard in my mouth. I pushed it around my plate and watched Lucas and Nora at the head of the table, deep in conversation that required them to lean close, that involved touching and laughing and a level of intimacy that had nothing to do with professional mentorship. Trevor tried to make conversation with me about cryptocurrency. He explained blockchain technology like I was 5 years old, used hand gestures to illustrate concepts he assumed I couldn't grasp. I nodded in appropriate places, made encouraging sounds, and thought about the evidence folder on my phone that was about to destroy everything Lucas had built. The main course came. Filet mignon for most of the table, and the seafood course Lucas had added specifically because Nora loved oysters. I watched her eat them, watched Lucas watch her eat them, watched this entire performance play out while I sat invisible between two men who'd barely acknowledged my existence. The photographer moved around the table during dinner, capturing moments. The group laughing at some joke. Marcus raising his glass. Miguel and his date in conversation. And repeatedly, constantly Nora and Lucas together. Their body language in every photo telling a story that any reasonable person could read. I pulled out my phone under the table and checked the time. 8:45. The toast would come soon after the main course was cleared, before dessert arrived. Lucas had mentioned the schedule during one of his planning sessions. He'd choreographed this entire evening down to the minute. I opened my email app and started composing 3 messages. Same subject line for each. Urgent ethics violation requiring immediate review. Same attachments. 173 pieces of evidence, organized by date and category. Different recipients. General Counsel of Brennan Logistics, the company's ethics hotline, and Patricia Chin, the CEO's executive assistant who owed me a favor from 5 years ago. I didn't send them yet. I waited. Because I needed one more piece of evidence. The final piece that would make everything undeniable. Dessert plates were cleared. Coffee was served. Lucas stood up, tapped his wine glass with a fork, and the room gradually quieted to hear what the birthday boy had to say. Lucas stood at the head of the table with his wine glass raised, his cheeks flushed from alcohol and attention. The room had quieted completely. All 14 guests turned toward him expectantly. This was his moment. The speech he'd probably been rehearsing for days. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, he began, his voice carrying easily across the private dining room. Turning 40 feels like a real milestone, you know? And sharing it with the people who matter most means everything to me. He paused, let the moment breathe, and I watched him scan the faces around the table. His gym friends nodding supportively. Miguel and his date smiling politely. Trevor and Sarah looking engaged. Marcus with that expression of brotherly pride he always wore at family events. Lucas's eyes didn't land on me. Not even for a second. But I especially want to recognize someone who's been instrumental in my growth this past year. He turned slightly toward Nora, his body language shifting into something more intimate, more personal. Nora, you've pushed me to exceed every expectation I had for myself. You've helped me reach for goals I didn't think were possible. You've made me into the professional I've always wanted to be. His voice had taken on a quality I recognized from our early years together. The same warmth he used to reserve for talking about us, about our future, about the life we were building. Now he was using it for her. You invested in me when others overlooked me. You believed in me when I doubted myself. And I honestly don't know where I'd be without your guidance and support. He raised his glass higher, and the table followed suit, everyone lifting their wine glasses in preparation for the toast. To my honored guest, my mentor, and someone I'm incredibly grateful to have in my life. To Nora Castellano. The room erupted in polite applause. Glasses clinked. People took sips of their wine and made appreciative noises about the sentiment. And then Nora stood up. She moved around the table toward Lucas with a smile that looked genuinely touched, genuinely emotional. When she reached him, she didn't extend her hand for a professional handshake. She didn't give him a brief side hug. She wrapped both arms around him, pulled him close and pressed her face against his neck in an embrace that lasted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds. I counted each one, my phone already in my hand under the table. Lucas's arms went around her waist. His eyes closed briefly. His entire body relaxed into the hug in a way that spoke of familiarity, of comfort, of a physical intimacy that had nothing to do with professional mentorship. The photographer captured it from multiple angles. I could see the flash going off, could see him moving to get different perspectives on this moment that Lucas had apparently decided was worth documenting for posterity. When they finally separated, Nora said something to Lucas that I couldn't hear from my position in the middle of the table. Whatever it was made him smile in a way that transformed his entire face, made him look younger and happier than I'd seen him in months. I opened my email app and pulled up the 3 draft messages I'd prepared earlier. Same subject line for each. Same body text. Same attachments. 173 pieces of evidence, plus the seating chart photos I'd taken earlier, plus whatever images the photographer would eventually provide. My finger hovered over the send button for exactly 5 seconds. This was it. This was the point of no return. Once I sent these emails, everything would change. Lucas's career would be in jeopardy. Nora's career would likely be over. Our marriage would definitely end, though it had probably ended months ago when Lucas started buying new cologne and getting bi-weekly haircuts. I clicked send at exactly 9:43 in the evening, watching the 3 messages disappear from my outbox and enter the digital void where they would arrive in 3 different inboxes at Brennan Logistics and set off a chain reaction I'd carefully planned. Then I finished my wine, set down my glass and excused myself to the restroom. The bathroom at Marcello's was all marble and soft lighting, the kind of place designed to make people feel elegant and sophisticated. I stood at the sink and reapplied my lipstick with hands that were surprisingly steady. My reflection looked calm, composed, like a woman who just enjoyed a nice dinner rather than one who just potentially destroyed 2 careers with 3 carefully worded emails. I took my time, washed my hands, fixed a strand of hair that had come loose from my updo, checked my phone to confirm the emails had sent successfully. All 3 showed as delivered. No bounce backs. No errors. When I returned to the dining room 10 minutes later, I could immediately see that something had shifted. The energy in the room had changed from celebratory to tense. Conversations were happening in hushed tones. People were glancing toward the head of the table where Nora sat with her phone face up, screen illuminated with an incoming call. She stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. I watched her face transform in real time. Confident to confused to concerned to absolutely horrified, all in the span of maybe 10 seconds. "Yes, this is Nora Castellano," she said into the phone, standing abruptly and moving away from the table toward the hallway. "What? No, I'm at a dinner. Can this wait until Monday?" Apparently it couldn't because she kept walking, her voice rising in pitch as she moved out of earshot. I could see her through the doorway, pacing in the hallway, her free hand gesturing frantically. Her body language had gone from poised and confident to agitated and defensive. Lucas watched her go, confusion clear on his face. The other guests had stopped pretending not to notice. Trevor leaned over and whispered to me, "What do you think is happening?" I shrugged, picked up my wine glass even though it was empty. "I have no idea." Marcus caught my eye from across the table, his expression suspicious in a way that made my stomach tighten. He'd never liked me, but he knew his brother well enough to sense when something was off. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, focusing on the wilting roses in the centerpiece. Nora was on the phone for 5 full minutes. I watched Lucas check his own phone repeatedly, probably hoping for a text from her explaining what was happening. The other guests made awkward small talk, pretending everything was normal while clearly being deeply invested in whatever drama was unfolding. When Nora finally returned to the table, her face was pale under her makeup. Her hands were shaking visibly as she grabbed her burgundy clutch from the back of her chair. I have to go, she said, her voice cracking around the edges in a way that betrayed just how not okay everything was. There's been some kind of emergency at the office. Lucas stood immediately, his chair scraping against the floor. What kind of emergency? Do you need help? Should I come with you? No. The word came out sharp, almost panicked. Then she seemed to remember the audience, softened her tone. No, Lucas, you stay and enjoy your birthday. This doesn't concern you. But the way she looked at him told a completely different story. Her eyes said, this concerns you entirely. This concerns both of us. This is going to destroy everything we've built. She left without saying goodbye to anyone else, her heels clicking rapidly across the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded like flight. Like escape. Like someone running from a fire they'd started themselves. The room fell silent after the door closed behind her. 14 people sitting around a table covered in white roses and half-eaten desserts, all processing what they'd just witnessed. Then Trevor cleared his throat and said something about how demanding corporate life could be, and a few people murmured agreement, and slowly conversations resumed in hushed tones that suggested everyone was speculating about what had really just happened. Lucas stood at the head of the table looking lost. He checked his phone again, probably hoping for a text or call from Nora explaining the emergency. Nothing came. He tried to smile, to make a joke about how even his birthday dinner couldn't escape work drama, but it fell flat. No one laughed. Within 30 minutes, guests started making excuses to leave. Sarah claimed an early morning. Miguel remembered a prior commitment he'd somehow forgotten about until just now. The gym friends left as a group, clapping Lucas on the back and thanking him for dinner on their way out. By 10:30, only 3 of us remained in the private dining room that had been full of celebration an hour earlier. Lucas sat at the head of the table. Marcus was nursing what was probably his 5th drink, and I gathered my coat from the back of my chair with slow, deliberate movements. The white roses had started to wilt in the warm room, their perfect petals dropping onto the tablecloth like surrender flags. The black and gold balloons sagged slightly in their corners. The elaborate calligraphy name cards sat at empty seats, documenting who had been here to witness whatever this evening had been. Lucas stared at his phone like it held answers to questions he didn't yet know to ask. What the hell was that about? He said, not quite directing the question at anyone specific but looking in my direction like I might have insight. I finished buttoning my coat, picked up my purse and smiled at him with an expression that I knew didn't reach my eyes. I have no idea, darling. But I'm sure you'll find out soon enough. I walked to where he sat, leaned down and kissed his cheek. His skin was warm from wine and stress. I could smell his expensive cologne, the Tom Ford I'd never bought him. Happy birthday, I whispered, then left him sitting there surrounded by half-empty wine glasses, wilting roses, and the ruins of the celebration he'd spent 2 weeks planning. I drove home from Marcelo's alone, the city lights blurring past my windows as I navigated streets I'd driven 1,000 times before. My hands were steady on the wheel. My breathing was calm. I felt nothing, which was strange considering I'd just set in motion events that would destroy my husband's career and end my marriage. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Lucas hadn't come home yet. Probably still at the restaurant trying to understand what had happened to Nora, why she'd fled his birthday dinner like the building was on fire. Or maybe he'd gone to Marcus's place to drink and complain about how the evening had been ruined by some mysterious work emergency. I went inside, hung up my coat and poured myself a glass of wine I didn't really want but felt like I should drink anyway. Stood in our kitchen looking at the marble countertops and stainless steel appliances and thought about how much money we'd spent renovating this space 3 years ago. How we'd argued about cabinet hardware and backsplash tiles. How Lucas had insisted on the expensive coffee maker that he never used anymore because he always stopped at the coffee shop near his office on the way to work. My phone sat on the counter, screen dark and silent. The emails had been sent 9 hours ago. By now, someone at Brennan Logistics had seen them. Multiple someones. People in legal and HR and executive leadership were probably already having emergency meetings about what to do with a regional director who'd been photographed embracing a subordinate employee at a private celebration. I finished my wine, rinsed the glass and went upstairs to bed. Lucas still wasn't home. I woke at 6:30 to sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows and the sound of Lucas's breathing beside me. He must have come in late, crawled into bed without waking me. I turned my head slightly and looked at him sleeping there, his face relaxed in a way it never was when he was awake anymore. He looked younger like this. More like the man I'd married. I got up quietly, showered, dressed in comfortable clothes. It was Saturday. No work. Just whatever came next. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the kitchen, filling the house with the smell of dark roast. I was pouring my first cup when my phone rang at exactly 7:15. Unknown number. I answered on the third ring. Harper Brennan speaking. Mrs. Brennan, this is James Whitfield, attorney for Nora Castellano. His voice was smooth and practiced, the kind of professional polish that came from years of threatening people on behalf of clients who could afford his rates. I'm calling regarding serious allegations you filed against my client that have caused significant damage to her reputation and career. I said nothing. Just listened. Made a mental note to grab the legal pad I kept in the kitchen drawer for moments like this. My client has been devastated by these baseless accusations. Her reputation has been destroyed, her career is in jeopardy, and all because of false allegations you filed maliciously. We're prepared to pursue every legal remedy available unless you immediately retract your statements and issue a public apology. I let him finish his entire speech without interruption. Pulled out the legal pad, made notes about his tone and word choices and the specific threats he was making. When he finally stopped talking, I took a sip of my coffee and responded in the calm, professional voice I'd perfected over 12 years of working in litigation. First, counselor, nothing I sent was false. Every piece of evidence is documented and verifiable. Second, I didn't file allegations. I reported a workplace ethics concern to the appropriate corporate authorities, which is not only legal but encouraged under Brennan Logistics' own employee handbook. Third, if your client's reputation has been damaged, it's because she chose to engage in inappropriate conduct with a subordinate employee and then display that inappropriate relationship publicly in front of witnesses and a professional photographer. I paused, let that sink in. I didn't destroy her reputation. He did that herself. I just made sure people saw it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear papers rustling, could almost hear him recalculating his approach, realizing that I wasn't going to be easily intimidated or convinced to back down. Mrs. Brennan, we will pursue this aggressively, he said, his voice harder now, the smooth practiced tone giving way to something more threatening. I smiled even though he couldn't see it. Please do. I look forward to discovery, where we'll subpoena all communications between your client and my husband, all expense reports, all text messages, everything. I'm sure that will go wonderfully for her. I took another sip of coffee, let him process that. Oh, and counselor, you might want to advise your client that threatening the spouse of her subordinate employee is probably not going to help her case with the ethics investigation. But you do what you think is best. I hung up before he could respond, set my phone down on the counter, and finished my coffee in the quiet kitchen while Lucas continued sleeping upstairs. By noon, I'd separated our bank accounts. The joint checking and savings were divided according to what each of us had contributed. The investment accounts I'd inherited from my grandmother were transferred entirely into my name. The house was already in my name, had been since before we married because my parents had helped with the down payment and wanted to protect that investment. I made phone calls to my attorney friend Sarah, who specialized in divorce cases where one spouse's infidelity created grounds for favorable settlement terms. Made arrangements to have papers drafted. Confirmed that everything I was doing was legal and documented and couldn't be challenged later. Lucas came downstairs around 2 in the afternoon looking like he hadn't slept at all despite being in bed for 8 hours. His hair stuck up at odd angles. His eyes were bloodshot. He wore sweatpants and a t-shirt that had been clean yesterday but now looked slept-in and wrinkled. Harper, he said, standing in the living room doorway while I worked on my laptop. Harper, something happened. The company called me this morning. They've placed me on administrative leave pending an investigation into my relationship with Nora. I looked up from my laptop but said nothing. Just waited. They're saying someone filed a complaint. That there's evidence of inappropriate conduct. They suspended Nora yesterday after the dinner. She was escorted out by security this morning. His voice cracked slightly. They terminated her, Harper. They fired her for ethics violations. He looked at me like I might have answers. Like I might be able to explain how his perfect birthday celebration had turned into a career-ending disaster in less than 24 hours. What did you do? His voice wasn't angry yet. Just confused. Desperate for understanding. Like maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could be fixed if only someone would explain what was happening. I closed my laptop carefully and stood up. Walked to the side table where I'd placed the manila envelope I'd prepared that morning. Picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the papers inside. Everything I'd been building toward for months, reduced to a single envelope. "I made you a promise," I said simply, crossing the room to hand it to him. "I told you that if you made her your honored guest, you'd regret it. You didn't believe me. That was your choice." Lucas took the envelope with hands that were shaking slightly. Opened it and pulled out the papers inside. I watched his face as he read the first page. Divorce petition. His eyes widened, confusion giving way to shock. He flipped to the second page. Financial disclosures showing how I'd separated our assets, how everything was already divided, how the house was in my name and would remain in my name. How his access to our joint accounts had been restricted. He went back to the first page, read it again like maybe he'd misunderstood something crucial. "Harper, what is this? You're divorcing me? Over inviting my boss to my birthday dinner?" I walked back to the side table and picked up a single photograph I'd printed that morning. The photographer had sent a preview gallery late last night, probably trying to get final approval before processing payment. I'd downloaded every image that featured Lucas and Nora together. This one was the most damning. 7 seconds captured from the perfect angle. Nora's face pressed against Lucas's neck. His arms wrapped around her waist. Both of them with their eyes closed, completely absorbed in an embrace that had nothing to do with professional mentorship and everything to do with intimate familiarity. I handed him the photograph. Watched him stare at it, watched the color drain from his face as he saw himself through my eyes. Through the eyes of everyone at that dinner. Through the eyes of the ethics committee at his company who were currently reviewing 173 pieces of evidence that told the same story this single image told. "I'm divorcing you because you had an inappropriate relationship with your boss and humiliated me publicly while doing it. Because you prioritized her over me for months. Because you stopped seeing me as your wife and started seeing me as an obstacle to whatever you were building with her." Lucas looked from the photograph to me and back to the photograph. His mouth opened and closed several times without sound coming out. "I need you to leave," I said quietly. "This is my house. The locks have already been changed. Your things are packed in boxes in the garage. You can take them now or arrange a time to pick them up later, but you can't stay here." He just stood there holding divorce papers in one hand and a photograph of his own betrayal in the other, looking like a man who'd suddenly realized he'd been standing on the edge of a cliff the entire time without noticing. Lucas sat on the couch for 3 hours that Saturday afternoon, the divorce papers spread across the coffee table in front of him, the photograph of him and Nora face down like he couldn't bear to look at it anymore. He'd call someone, have a hushed conversation I couldn't quite hear from the kitchen, then hang up and stare at the papers again. Call someone else. Repeat the cycle. I made myself dinner. Just pasta with vegetables, nothing elaborate. The act of cooking felt normal, grounding, like maybe if I went through familiar motions everything else would start making sense too. The water boiled. The pasta cooked. I drained it and added olive oil and garlic. Plated a single serving and ate at the kitchen counter while Lucas sat 15 feet away in the living room acting like his world had ended. Maybe it had. I didn't particularly care anymore. My phone rang at 6:30. Marcus's name flashed across the screen. I considered not answering, then decided I might as well get this conversation over with. He'd call back anyway, keep calling until I picked up, because that's what Marcus did when he decided something needed his attention. "What the hell did you do to my brother?" No greeting. No preamble. Just accusation delivered in that sharp tone he used when he thought someone had wronged his family. "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly, setting down my fork. "How are you this evening? Don't play games with me, Harper. Lucas just called me. He's devastated. He's on leave from work, his boss got fired, and you're serving him with divorce papers? Over what? Over him inviting his boss to his birthday dinner? That's insane. That's vindictive. That's consequences," I interrupted, my voice level and controlled. "Your brother spent 6 months having an inappropriate relationship with his boss. Spending company money on dinners I knew nothing about. Texting her at midnight. Changing everything about himself to impress her. I gave him one warning. One clear boundary. He crossed it publicly and humiliated me in front of 14 people. I paused, let that sink in. So yes, I reported an ethics violation to his company using evidence I'd been collecting for months. And yes, I'm divorcing him. What exactly did you think would happen? There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Marcus breathing, could practically hear him recalibrating his approach. Lucas said you were being paranoid. That there was nothing inappropriate going on with Nora. That you misinterpreted professional interactions because you were jealous of his success. Of course that's what Lucas had told him. Of course he'd framed this as me being the problem rather than taking responsibility for his own choices. Did he show you the photograph? I asked. The one from his birthday dinner where she's hugging him with her face pressed against his neck for 7 seconds while a professional photographer documented it? Did he mention the midnight text messages? The expense reports for dinners at restaurants we've never been to together? The hotels charged to his corporate card during times he claimed to be working late at the office. Another pause. Longer this time. He said those were all explainable. Work dinners with clients. Late nights at the office where he needed to crash in a hotel instead of driving home tired. Then he lied to you, Marcus. Just like he's been lying to me for months. I hung up before he could respond. Finished my dinner in silence while Lucas continued his vigil on the couch, probably calling more people to tell his version of events. The version where I was unstable and vindictive and destroying his life over nothing. Jessica called on Monday morning while I was getting ready for work. My closest friend since college, the person I'd trusted with everything for over 15 years. I saw her name on my screen and felt something twist in my chest because I already knew this conversation wasn't going to go well. Harper, honey, she said when I answered, her voice careful in a way that told me Lucas had already gotten to her. I talked to Lucas yesterday. He's really struggling with everything that's happened. I said nothing. Just listened. Finished applying my mascara in the bathroom mirror while she continued. He said you sent evidence to his company that got his boss fired and now he might lose his job too. He's devastated, Harper. He's staying at his brother's place because you kicked him out of the house. She paused and I could hear her choosing her next words carefully. Don't you think maybe you overreacted? I mean, I know having his boss at his birthday dinner wasn't ideal, but destroying 2 careers seems like a pretty extreme response to feeling jealous. There was the narrative Lucas was spinning. That I was jealous and overreacting and vindictive. That he'd done nothing wrong except invite his boss to a party, and I'd responded by ruining his life. Jessica, I said slowly, setting down my mascara and looking at my reflection in the mirror. Did Lucas tell you about the midnight texts between him and Nora? The secret dinners? The expense reports showing hotels during times he claimed to be working late. There was a pause on her end. He said those were all innocent. That you were reading too much into normal professional interactions. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The realization that even my closest friend was willing to believe Lucas's version of events without questioning it. That 15 years of friendship meant less than one phone call from my husband painting me as the villain. I see, I said quietly. Thank you for calling, Jessica. I need some space to process everything right now. I hung up before she could respond. Finished getting ready for work. Drove to the office and spent the day documenting cases for attorneys who trusted my judgment because I'd proven over 12 years that I knew how to evaluate evidence and distinguish truth from convenient narratives. Patricia from Brennan Logistics called me on Thursday afternoon. I'd been expecting her call, had known it was coming since the moment I sent those emails on Friday night. Harper, thank you for taking my call, she said, her voice professional but warmer than it needed to be. We'd worked together on a complex employment case 5 years ago, and she'd always struck me as someone who genuinely cared about doing the right thing even when it was difficult. Of course, Patricia. How can I help? I want you to know that the company takes workplace ethics extremely seriously. Your report triggered an immediate review, and what we've found in the last 72 hours has been deeply concerning. She paused and I could hear papers rustling. We've identified multiple policy violations, inappropriate use of company funds, and a pattern of preferential treatment that extends beyond just your husband. We need to understand the full scope of what was happening, and we need your testimony about what you observed and when. We met the next morning at a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us frequented. I brought printed copies of everything I'd collected, organized in a binder with tabs and annotations. Patricia brought a legal pad and a voice recorder with my permission. For 2 hours I walked her through the timeline. When I first noticed changes in Lucas's behavior. When I discovered the text. When I photographed expense reports. When I filed the anonymous complaint 3 months ago hoping it would be enough to trigger an investigation without me having to destroy my marriage myself. Patricia took extensive notes, asked clarifying questions, requested specific dates and times. When I finished, she looked at me with something that might have been sympathy or respect or both. "Harper, I need to tell you something," she said, closing her legal pad. "Since Nora's termination on Saturday morning, 3 other employees have come forward with their own complaints about her behavior. Similar patterns of preferential treatment, inappropriate communications, boundary violations. What you documented with Lucas wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem that the company should have addressed years ago." I absorbed this information in silence. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt sick thinking about how many other marriages might have been damaged by Nora's inability to maintain professional boundaries. Friday evening, I was upstairs packing Lucas's remaining clothes into boxes when I heard the front door open. I froze, listening. Heavy footsteps in the entryway. Not Lucas's gate. Someone else. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs before I could react, his expensive suit wrinkled from a long work week. His expression set in that particular combination of anger and righteousness he wore when he thought someone in his family had been wronged. "We need to talk," he said, not asking permission, just announcing his presence like he had every right to be in my house uninvited. I set down the box I was packing and looked at him calmly. "You need to leave, Marcus. This is my house and you don't have permission to be here. Lucas gave me a key years ago. I'm not leaving until we talk about what you're doing to my brother." He crossed his arms, positioned himself at the top of the stairs like he was blocking my exit. "Lucas is falling apart. He's staying at my place because you won't let him in his own house. He's drinking too much. He can't sleep. And you're up here packing his things like he's some stranger you're evicting." I met his gaze without flinching. "What happened to respecting your spouse, Marcus? What happened to maintaining appropriate boundaries with your boss? What happened to listening when your wife tells you something makes her uncomfortable? This isn't about boundaries. This is about you being threatened by a successful woman and punishing Lucas for having an important professional relationship." I picked up the photograph from the bedside table where I'd left it. The 7-second hug captured from the perfect angle. Walked over and handed it to Marcus. "Look at this and tell me it's just a professional relationship." He looked at the image. His jaw tightened. He handed it back to me without comment. "I worked through problems for 9 years, I said quietly. I compromised and adapted and stayed quiet while Lucas prioritized his career over our marriage. But I will not stay quiet while he has an affair and then acts surprised that there are consequences." Marcus stood there for a long moment, the fight seeming to drain out of him as he processed what I'd said. "You need to leave now," I repeated. "And give me that key before you go." Marcus left without another word, fishing the spare key from his pocket and dropping it into my outstretched hand before walking down the stairs and out of my house. I heard his car start in the driveway, listened to the sound fade as he drove away, then went back to packing Lucas's things into boxes that would remove the last physical traces of him from the space we'd shared for 5 years. The weekend passed in a strange kind of quiet. I cleaned the house thoroughly, scrubbing away 9 years of accumulated life together. Donated items Lucas hadn't taken that held no sentimental value. Rearranged furniture to change the energy of rooms that felt too full of memories I no longer wanted. Made the house mine again in ways it hadn't been since before we married. Monday morning arrived with rain that turned the world gray and soft. I was getting ready for work when my phone lit up with notifications. Text messages from colleagues. Emails with links. A voicemail from Patricia at Brennan Logistics giving me a heads up about something that was about to become very public. I opened the first link and found myself reading a press release on Brennan Logistics' official website, time-stamped at 8 in the morning. The statement was brief, professionally worded, and absolutely devastating in its implications. Brennan Logistics had terminated Regional Director Nora Castellano following an internal investigation that revealed multiple violations of company ethics policies, including inappropriate relationships with subordinate employees and misuse of company resources. The company was conducting a comprehensive review of all personnel decisions made under her supervision and remained committed to maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. The statement didn't mention Lucas by name. Didn't need to. Everyone in his department would know exactly what inappropriate relationships with subordinate employees meant. Everyone who'd been at that birthday dinner would understand what had triggered this investigation. My phone rang within minutes. A former colleague asking if I'd seen the news. Another asking if I was okay, if there was anything she could do. A third simply saying she'd always known something was off about Nora but hadn't felt safe saying anything until now. I responded to each with brief, professional acknowledgments. Confirmed I was fine. Declined offers of support that felt more like fishing for gossip than genuine concern. Then I silenced my phone and finished getting ready for work. By Tuesday morning, the story had taken on a life of its own beyond corporate press releases and internal gossip. Someone had leaked photos from Lucas's birthday dinner to a workplace blog called Corporate Confessions, and the post was going viral across every social media platform where professionals gathered to judge other people's mistakes. I found the blog post through a LinkedIn notification, someone I barely knew sharing it with commentary about professional boundaries and workplace ethics. The headline read, "When Mentorship Crosses the Line, a Birthday Dinner That Ended 2 Careers." The post featured professional quality images from the photographer Lucas had hired. Multiple angles of the 7-second hug, Nora's face pressed against his neck, his arms wrapped around her waist, both of them with their eyes closed in an embrace that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. Photos of them at the head of the table, leaning close in conversation, her hand on his arm. Images that told a story anyone could read regardless of what Lucas claimed about the nature of their relationship. And there, in the background of several photos, was me. Sitting in the middle of the table between Marcus and Trevor, looking directly at the camera with an expression the blogger described as, the wife who knew exactly what was happening and was already planning her next move. I stared at that description for a long moment. The blogger had no idea how accurate that assessment was. No idea I'd been sitting there with my phone under the table, finger hovering over the send button on 3 emails that would destroy everything Lucas had built. The post had been shared over 2,000 times by mid-morning. The comments section was filled with people analyzing every detail of the photos, debating whether the relationship had been physical or just emotional, discussing corporate ethics policies and power dynamics and what should happen to employees who violated professional boundaries this egregiously. Lucas's name was suddenly searchable, linked forever to this scandal. His professional identity reduced to the guy who had an inappropriate relationship with his boss and got caught at his own birthday dinner. I closed the blog post and went back to work. Documented evidence for cases that had nothing to do with my personal life. Found comfort in the familiar rhythm of legal processes and procedures that made sense in ways human relationships apparently didn't. Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, then decided at the last moment to pick up. "Mrs. Brennan? This is David Castellano. I'm Nora's husband." He paused and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. Or I was her husband. "I filed for divorce yesterday." I said nothing for a moment, processing this information. Then, "I'm sorry you're going through this. I found text messages between her and your husband going back 8 months. Hundreds of them." His voice cracked slightly. Messages that were way beyond anything professional. Late-night conversations about personal things. Inside jokes. Plans to meet for dinners and drinks. She saved his contact under a fake name in her phone, which is how I never noticed before. He kept talking and I let him. Sometimes people just needed to speak their truth out loud to someone who would understand without judgment. I confronted her on Sunday after she got fired. Asked her how long it had been going on, whether she'd slept with him, whether she'd ever actually cared about our marriage, or if I'd just been convenient while she was building her career and having affairs with subordinates. He paused, took a shaky breath. She admitted everything. Said it started last summer at some company retreat. That she didn't mean for it to get serious. That she never meant to hurt anyone. "But she did hurt people," I said quietly. "She hurt everyone. Me. Our kids, who now have to deal with their mother being publicly humiliated for having an affair with someone she supervised. They're teenagers, Mrs. Brennan. They have to go to school and face their friends who've probably seen those photos online. Who've probably heard the gossip about what their mother did." We talked for 20 minutes. He shared details about weekend work conferences that Nora had attended alone, late-night phone calls she'd taken in another room, changes in her behavior over the past year that he'd noticed but rationalized away because he'd trusted her. By the end of the call, We'd formed an unspoken alliance. Two people who'd been betrayed by spouses who should have known better. Who should have valued their marriages more than whatever temporary satisfaction they'd found in an inappropriate relationship that was always going to end badly. "Thank you for listening," David said before we hung up. "And thank you for reporting what was happening. If you hadn't, I might never have known. Might have spent years wondering why my marriage felt wrong without understanding that my wife was investing her emotional energy in someone else." Thursday afternoon, Lucas came to collect his belongings. I watched from the living room window as he pulled up in Marcus's car, sat in the driveway for a long moment just staring at the house, then slowly got out and walked toward the front door. I'd left it unlocked for him. Left his boxes organized in the garage by category so he could load them efficiently and leave. I didn't want a prolonged goodbye or a dramatic confrontation. I just wanted him to take his things and let me start rebuilding my life without him. He found me in the kitchen, the same place where this had all started 10 days ago, with a promise he'd dismissed as paranoia. "Harper." His voice was rough, exhausted. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in days. "Harper, I'm sorry. I know I screwed up. I know I didn't listen when you warned me." He stopped, swallowed hard. I could see him gathering courage for whatever he was about to say next. "But I never slept with her. I swear to you I never physically cheated. It was just emotional. Just text messages and dinners and conversations where someone actually listened to me and made me feel valued in ways I hadn't felt in years. It was wrong, I know it was wrong, but it wasn't physical." I held up my hand to stop him before he could continue justifying choices that had destroyed our marriage regardless of whether they'd been physical or emotional. "It doesn't matter, Lucas. Physical or emotional, you cheated. You prioritized her over me. You humiliated me at your birthday dinner in front of everyone we know. And now you're facing consequences for choices you made over and over again for months." I set down my coffee mug and looked at him directly. "I'm not interested in your apologies or your justifications. Take your things and leave." Lucas stood in my kitchen for a long moment after I told him to take his things and leave. His mouth opened and closed several times like he was searching for words that might change the outcome of this conversation, might undo the consequences of choices he'd made over and over again for 8 months. He found nothing to say. I walked past him to the garage where I'd stacked his belongings in clearly labeled boxes. Clothes in one section. Books and personal items in another. Work documents he might need in a third. Everything organized and ready for efficient removal because I wanted this done quickly and cleanly. "Everything's here," I said, gesturing to the boxes. "You can load them into Marcus's car. I've already arranged for your remaining furniture to be donated next week unless you want to schedule a time to pick it up." Lucas looked at the boxes like they represented the sum total of 9 years of marriage. Which, in a physical sense, they did. Everything else, the house, the joint accounts, the life we'd built, belonged to me now through careful planning and legal documentation that had started long before his birthday dinner. He began carrying boxes to the car in silence. I watched from the doorway, not helping, not hindering, just witnessing the final removal of his physical presence from my space. It took him 40 minutes to load everything. When he finished, he stood in the driveway looking back at the house one last time. "Harper," he called out, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "Harper, please. We can fix this. I'll do anything. I'll quit my job, we can move somewhere else, start over completely. Just please don't do this." "Your job already quit you," I said quietly. "And there's nothing to fix. This marriage ended months ago when you started prioritizing Nora over me. I'm just making it official." He got in the car and drove away. I closed the garage door and went back inside to a house that suddenly felt lighter despite nothing physical having changed except the absence of boxes that had been sitting there for less than a week. The divorce proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. Lucas's attorney was a tired-looking man named Gerald who charged reasonable rates because he understood that Lucas couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that might have mounted a serious challenge to the terms I was proposing. Gerald tried his best, arguing that the asset distribution was unfair, that Lucas deserved more consideration given the length of the marriage. But the prenuptial agreement I'd updated during our refinancing was ironclad. My attorney Sarah walked through every clause with calm precision, demonstrating that everything had been legally executed, that Lucas had signed willingly with full knowledge of what he was agreeing to, that the terms were enforceable under state law. The house remained mine. The inheritance money that had funded the down payment remained protected. The retirement accounts I'd built before we married stayed in my name. Lucas would leave our marriage with his personal belongings, his car that still had 2 years of payments remaining and nothing else. The divorce hearing was scheduled for mid-November, 6 weeks after the birthday dinner that had started everything. I spent those weeks methodically building my new life. Met with a realtor about selling the house because every room held memories of a marriage that had been dying slowly while I'd been too focused on holding it together to notice it was already gone. Started therapy with a counselor named Dr. Morrison who specialized in betrayal trauma, working through the complicated tangle of relief and grief that came with ending something that had once meant everything. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected while I'd been busy documenting evidence and planning revenge. Called people I hadn't spoken to in months and suggested coffee dates that had nothing to do with my divorce or Lucas's scandal. Slowly rebuilt a social life that existed independent of my marriage and its spectacular implosion. Late October arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made everything feel possible. I was at work when Lucas called, his number flashing across my screen during a meeting I excused myself from to answer in the hallway. "Harper, they fired me." His voice was shaking, teetering on the edge of panic. "Brennan Logistics just terminated my employment. The letter says it's effective immediately. I have no income. No references. Everyone in the industry knows about the scandal because of that blog post. How am I supposed to find another job? How am I supposed to live?" I listened to him spiral for 5 full minutes, his words tumbling over each other in increasing desperation. When he finally paused for breath, I responded in the calm, measured tone I'd perfected over 12 years of working in litigation. "You'll figure it out, Lucas. The same way I would have had to figure it out if you'd left me for Nora. You'll apply for unemployment. You'll take a lower-level position somewhere far from here where people don't know your name. You'll rebuild your career from the ground up. Or you won't. Either way, it's no longer my problem to solve." I hung up before he could respond. Went back into my meeting and focused on work that had nothing to do with my ex-husband's inability to face the natural consequences of his own choices. Patricia called me in early November and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. We chose a different cafe this time, one closer to both our offices, because the need for secrecy had passed. Everyone who needed to know what had happened already knew. She updated me on Nora's situation with the kind of clinical detachment that came from having watched too many workplace scandals unfold over a long career in corporate administration. Nora was blacklisted in the industry. The Corporate Confessions blog post had ensured that anyone who Googled her name found pages of results about inappropriate relationships with subordinates and ethics violations. She'd applied for positions at competitor companies and been rejected before interviews, her reputation preceding her application materials. Her husband David had filed for divorce and was seeking full custody of their 2 teenage children on grounds that her judgment was fundamentally compromised. Friends had taken sides or simply disappeared, unwilling to be associated with someone whose professional reputation had been destroyed so publicly and completely. The company was still dealing with fallout from her tenure as regional director. Every promotion she'd approved, every performance evaluation she'd written, every personnel decision she'd made now required review to determine whether it had been based on merit or influenced by personal relationships and preferential treatment. "We've identified at least 5 other employees who received favorable treatment that appears to have been connected to personal relationships with Nora," Patricia said, stirring her coffee absently. "Some of them have come forward voluntarily. Others we discovered through the investigation. It's a mess that's going to take months to fully untangle." I absorbed this information in silence. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part just felt tired. Tired of thinking about Nora and Lucas and the choices they'd made that had damaged so many lives beyond just their own. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "I appreciate you keeping me informed." Patricia nodded. "You did the right thing, Harper. Reporting what was happening. A lot of people wouldn't have had the courage to document everything and follow through. They would have just quietly suffered and let the behavior continue." 6 months passed. Spring arrived with cherry blossoms and longer days and the feeling that maybe the worst was finally behind me. The divorce had been finalized in November with terms exactly as I'd proposed. Lucas had moved to another city where Marcus had helped him find a position in middle management at a smaller logistics company that hadn't heard about the scandal or had decided to give him a second chance. I stood in my new apartment on the other side of town, smaller than the house but entirely mine, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind that came from knowing I'd done the right thing even when it was hard. Even when it meant destroying my marriage and my husband's career and facing judgment from people who thought I'd overreacted or been vindictive or taken revenge too far. Jessica had called in December to apologize. Admitted that Lucas had manipulated the story when he'd first talked to her, that she should have known better than to take his version of events at face value without asking for mine. We'd started meeting for coffee again on Saturday mornings, slowly rebuilding a friendship that had suffered collateral damage from my divorce. Work had promoted me in January. My dedication and attention to detail earning recognition from partners who appreciated employees who understood the value of proper documentation and ethical procedure. The promotion came with a salary increase that made the apartment affordable and allowed me to start saving for whatever came next. I'd even started dating again. Carefully. Taking my time. Building something new with someone who respected boundaries and listened when I spoke and seemed to understand that trust was something earned through consistent action rather than empty promises. People still asked me sometimes what I'd done that night at Marcello's to make Nora lose control. What I'd said or done that had caused her to flee the restaurant and get fired within hours. I always gave them the same answer. I didn't make her do anything. I just made sure that when she chose to cross every professional and personal line in front of witnesses, there were consequences. For everyone involved. Because that was the truth. I hadn't destroyed Lucas's career or Nora's reputation. They'd done that themselves with choices they'd made repeatedly over months. I'd simply documented it, reported it through proper channels, and allowed consequences to follow their natural course. Some people called it revenge. I called it justice. And either way, I was finally free. If this story of calculated justice had you captivated from beginning to end, show your support by hitting that like button right now. My favorite moment was when Harper sat calmly at that birthday dinner, phone in hand under the table, sending those 3 carefully documented emails while Lucas toasted Nora as his honored guest. What was your most satisfying moment in this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Want more compelling stories of consequences and courage like this one? Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we upload our next gripping tale.